Right. Welcome to the intro to Kubernetes SIG Apps. This is Adnan, I'm Matt, and we're going to walk you through Kubernetes SIG Apps today. If you aren't aware of Kubernetes SIGs, SIGs are the way Kubernetes is organized to organize its code ownership, its process ownership, and things like that. So it's just kind of that major organizational unit within Kubernetes because there's too much for any one or two or even small group of people to do. You have to have different groups and a structure for them to work together. And we'll walk through what SIG Apps is, but it's actually part of the Kubernetes development process. It owns code and things like that. So hi, I'm Matt, and with me is Adnan. We are two of the chairs of SIG Apps. The other two are Ken and Janet. They're here today, but they're obviously not in this session. And the chairs, we kind of oversee the process and the meetings that we have and things of that nature. So if you need to get a hold of somebody, if you're looking for how to get engaged or where to go with SIG Apps, the chairs in Kubernetes SIG Apps are the place to go, are the people to go to when you need that kind of thing. So I'll ask, has anybody ever been to one of these Kubernetes SIG Apps sessions before, an intro or any of those things, or are you all new? All right. Well, that's a good place to start. So I'm actually going to start a little bit like in the beginning, how we came about with this. And so if you actually go back to Kubernetes back in the beginning, and this is Kubernetes 1.0, the very first part of Kubernetes, and as you can see, this is back in 2015. If you look here, this is the packages directory, and this is where the controllers are. And so when you think about things today like stateful sets, deployments, all of those things, they came later. When Kubernetes came out, we didn't have those things. We didn't have those niceties. We had a very simple thing called a replication controller. It's still there, don't use it. But that was where Kubernetes came from. It didn't have a lot of the experience, the complexity, the ability to do things. You had to do a lot of this yourself or futz around with it to make it work. And if you go back, shortly thereafter this, Helm, the package manager, came out. And it was there to help package up configuration and so you could share it. And so very early on, this is the first version of Helm, which hasn't been in stable form for years. And this was very early on. It was one of the very first tools to help you share code, share configuration, and to deal with those applications and what does that application interface and lifecycle look like. So Kubernetes started out without much to it. And we noticed there was a problem. And there was talk of how do we do this? How do we improve on the experience? How do we learn how you can improve with the configuration? And what should you do? And that's when SIG Apps was born. And it was born shortly thereafter. You see, this is just like 5-6 months after Helm came out. We were watching everything. We started talking, and we came out with this. And we said, we need a way to deal with running applications in Kubernetes. The experience isn't great. How do we improve it? And this is actually the original, the very first charter, so you speak. It's a special interest group to deal with operating applications. And these were the things we worked at. How do you discuss it, right? You won't see things about owning code or anything like that because it started with this idea that there's a problem. And how do we get together to figure out that problem and work together to try to solve it to improve things? Now, if you fast forward to today, things have changed quite a bit. This is the current charter. You'll see that we have a scope where we cover the developing, deploying, and operating of applications. So we cover a bunch of things now. But we also have code, binaries, services, and we're going to actually talk about what those are in just a minute, the different parts. But now we own things. In fact, if you look at the code base today, you'll see StatefulSet. You'll see some of the other things we're going to cover in a minute. But you also see something else in here. You see that we talk about both the application developer and the operator. And if you look at that as personas, you actually see those as two different roles. Somebody's going to take an application and package it up. They may package up their own application, or they may package up somebody else's, right? If I'm going to take Postgres or MySQL, and I'm going to go operate that in a cluster, I'm operating somebody else's application. But I could also do something where I write an application, and it grabs events, and then when those events happen, I spin up jobs to go do something. And my application works as an app talking to the Kubernetes API to spin up Kubernetes things. And there I'm an app developer building tools that natively take advantage of parts of Kubernetes. And so there's that too. And there's these kind of different use cases out there depending on what you're going to do. And so we try to deal with how do we make Kubernetes better for both of these cases, in experience, in tooling, in many things. And so that's kind of the scope of SIG Apps today. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Adnan to talk more about the details.
Excellent, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so as Matt said, SIGs are the organizational unit in Kubernetes that own code. So in SIG Apps, you might be familiar with some of these things. We own deployments, DaemonSets, StatefulSets, so things in the apps API group, as well as the batch API group, so cron jobs and jobs, and a few other things like pod disruption budgets and a few other APIs as well. The other thing we also own is documentation around these API groups. So you can see here, we own a lot of the documentation for the Workloads APIs, but we also have some tutorials for actually how you actually go and use those APIs as part of like a greater application. So this is also one area that we continually need investment in. So when we want to make changes to a Kubernetes API, whether it be a core API or a completely new API, like all other SIGs, we go through the Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal process. And essentially, a KEP essentially just involves the high-level overview of the change that you're proposing, and motivations for that change, and then detailed design on how that change will actually be implemented, as well as a test plan and graduation criteria for promoting that change. You can find out more details about KEPs in the Kubernetes enhancement repo, and you can also take a look at some existing open KEPs in that repository as well. So if I was working on a completely new API or feature, the process I'd go through originally would be well, first I'd go through the KEP process and get my KEP out there approved. There'll probably be some back and forth on the design there, and we'd meet in SIG Apps meetings to discuss it. But once it's improved and we've got that merged in, I can start writing code. And I would then go and implement my new API and controller in the core Kubernetes API, introduce it as an alpha feature, get it out there in the next Kubernetes release, and as I'm iterating on it, get more alphas and betas out in Kubernetes releases. Eventually, I'd want to get that to a GA release and deprecate any previous older versions of that API. This process works well and has worked well in the past, but we're trying to improve it. One big issue with this process is that we're tied to the Kubernetes release cycle. So every time we want to make a change, a feature, we have to wait. Right now, the Kubernetes release cycle is every quarter, so we'd have to wait 3 months before new versions of that API can go out. So that introduces a lot of a lot of time in making those changes. So what we're trying to leverage now is this new process that that uses CRDs and custom controllers to start prototyping out ideas. So this way, if we're developing a new feature, we can iterate on it outside of core as CRDs and controllers, and kind of build up usage as a third-party extension. And then if we get enough users that are interested in this new feature or API, we can then consider it as a candidate to enter core. So an example of a project that's currently going through this process is the Application CRD and controller. So this is owned by SIG Apps. It's under the Kubernetes SIG's GitHub org here, and but it's implemented as an external controller and API. The Application CRD is essentially a metadata descriptor for groups of resources that resemble an application. And so basically, it's a way for you to define what applications are running in Kubernetes and get interoperability across different tools to represent the state of an application inside the cluster. Another thing that we're looking at working on in SIG Apps is the execution hook controller. So this was a KEP that just got approved. And originally, it's a proposal from SIG Storage, and the specific use case there is for the volume snapshot APIs. need a way to in order to take application consistent backups, they need a way to quiesce and unquiesce application state before and after taking a snapshot. And so they're working with SIG Apps, and we're going to start working on basically creating an API that allows users to, on demand, execute commands into containers in pods. So, how can you get involved? Well, SIG Apps meets every other Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Post KubeCon, I think the first meeting that we have coming back is the 2nd of December. For previous meetings, you can go to the Kubernetes YouTube channel, and there you'll find a SIG Apps meeting playlist, which has all of the prior meetings that have happened. And then also, if you go to the Kubernetes community repo here, you can find the SIG Apps folder, and there you'll find links to the YouTube channel. You'll find a link to our meeting agenda doc, where you can add things to the agenda prior to meetings to discuss. You also find links there for Slack and the mailing list and other areas that you can get involved in. And then since you're here at KubeCon, do check out the deep dive tomorrow, which will be hosted by the two other co-chairs, Ken and Janet, where they'll be going over a code walkthrough of, I think, the cron job controller. So that would be a good idea if you're interested in getting more involved and actually contributing code to SIG Apps. That's a great place to go and kind of learn more about how controllers are developed. So I kind of mentioned documentation is a big place that we need a lot more help. Matt kind of pointed out some great areas that we could start working on. So one is in the workloads concepts documentation here. There isn't really a good way to get an overview of all the workloads APIs. So it's kind of unclear right now to someone who's new to Kubernetes if they're going to this page whether they should use a deployment, a stateful set, or something else. So if we had a page here that kind of gave a brief intro into all the different controllers and different use cases, that would definitely be a really good change. And then the other one here is in SIG Apps a while ago, I think about a year ago, we came together and came up with a set of labels that are recommended to use in your deployments or in your resources. And a lot of the examples that we have in some of the tutorials don't actually make use of these labels. So this is another area that we could improve. We could actually go and update some of those example YAML files and add some of the recommended labels that we've defined, as well as just updating some of the images that those YAMLs are pointing to. They're just pretty old. And then code. Code-wise, as I mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity there to contribute. We have a lot of bugs. If you go to the Kubernetes repository, you'll find in the issues there, you can filter by SIG Apps, and you find all the issues that are related to the core Workloads APIs. One area that we're specifically trying to improve right now is the cron job API, and we're trying to get that to GA. So there's a KEP currently open specifically for cron job and what needs to be done to get that to GA, and that's somewhere that we really need help with. And then, of course, there's all the ecosystem projects, so Application CRD and controller, which I mentioned, and the execution hook. These all need work and need some more input, so there's repositories for those as well that you can go and get involved in. And then I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention some of the amazing ecosystem tooling that's out there. So things like Helm, Flux, Telepresence, Notary, and all the other great ecosystem tools that we've seen and demoed in SIG Apps. Keep building amazing tools, keep coming to SIG Apps and demoing those, and just come to SIG Apps and tell us how you're deploying and managing applications. That's really what we want to hear, ultimately. That's all we have. Anyone have any questions or discussion topics?
Can you go back a slide? Which one?
The one with the arrow, the blue one? Yeah, that's Flux.
That's Flux. It is a project that originally came out of Weaveworks. Yes, sorry. You wanted the question in the mic. So the question was, what is the arrow here? And that's Weaveworks Flux, and they recently broke it away from Weaveworks and turned it into a CNCF sandbox project. In fact, when we talked about more tools here, rather than picking some vendor tools to point out, these are all other CNCF projects that you can use in your applications in some way, shape, or form. Yes?
So I'm not.
No, so
Is this working?
I don't think it is.
is there a switch in it?
Is there a switch on it?
Hello? Okay. So I'm a developer, and I don't know Kubernetes, but I've heard that it's the new operating system / API to write for. Where do you recommend I go to start learning this new platform to write for?
Let me ask you a question then. What kind of things do you want to write for? Are you looking to run applications inside of Kubernetes? Are you looking to leverage Kubernetes native APIs to do interesting things? And I'll tell you this, one of the other projects, and it's escaping me, it's the build tool. What they do is they will spin up jobs based on events, and then those jobs will go execute something, right? And so they receive events from an eventing system, and then their application running in the background spins off a job to go deal with each of those events, and a job is a type of Kubernetes object, okay? What kinds of things are you looking to do? All of the above, specific things?
I want to try and keep the question focused, so sorry if it was too broad.
Yeah.
I guess I'm thinking of an app that I want to write for my organization, and it wasn't obvious what to hang it on, where it should live. It feels a little restricted to run it on one machine. Maybe a cron job would be a good example. So it gets scheduled and runs at the cluster level.
So Kubernetes, one of the ways in which it does things is if you have many machines, it will run those on the machine that has the right resources. Kubernetes comes from, are you familiar with Borg or Omega or the other Google tooling?
I've heard of them, yes.
Is anybody else in here not familiar with Borg and Omega? Okay, so I'll give a brief on this then. So at Google, they use, I guess I would call it, they call it the data center as a computer. And then inside of there, they have essentially clusters, and they treat a cluster as a single computer. And then their system is Borg. Now, Kubernetes is kind of descended from that. They took the lessons learned and did it. So when you think of Kubernetes, don't think of it as a computer that manages a bunch of servers. Think of it as a cluster operating system. And then you tell Kubernetes, run this, and then it finds the right place in the resources it has to just run it. And if you're going to run, say, a stateless application, you'll run it as a deployment. And then you might say, well, I need 3 instances of this deployment. And Kubernetes will know the resources in the cluster. It'll know what's going on, what other things are running in there. And then it will schedule those to run where the resources are. And so you don't have to worry about running it on different machines and that. And say you've got 3 of them and one of the hardware servers goes away and it had the thing on it. Kubernetes will notice that's gone. And it'll find another place in the resources it has and start it back up. That's kind of the way it does it. It treats a cluster then as an operating system, and Kubernetes handles the scheduling just like a typical operating system would. But it does it across all of the resources it knows about. Does that help?
I'll try and answer that with another question.
Please.
So this is the SIG Apps working group. Is there an application developer persona that is like the persona that you have in mind for the work of this working group?
We tend to do things around people who want to develop applications that are directly against the Kubernetes API, or those who want to run applications in it. And so if you want to run something like a deployment, which is normally a stateless app, or if you want to run what we call a StatefulSet, that's where you're going to run something that deals with state, and you have to care about state location and restarting things with state, like Postgres, MySQL, Mongo, something like that. We deal with those kinds of things, and then how do you operate those inside of Kubernetes? We've got different configuration files to describe your application, because Kubernetes does things in a declarative way. You tell it how you want things to be, how you want it to run, and then Kubernetes tries to make that so. And so we've got different configuration files depending on the type of thing you want to run and the data Kubernetes needs to have described to it. Does that help?
Yeah.
I know this is confusing. So one of the things you can do is, before we talked about documentation, I will jump way up there. There's documentation here. And you probably can't read it very clearly, but on the left side here, it says in the concepts area, there is workloads, and that's what we call it in Kubernetes. And if you come down here, there's controllers. Not organized very well, let me tell you. But you're going to see things like deployments, stateful sets, cron job at the bottom. What I would suggest doing is going and looking at those and reading the description at the top of each of those, because it's going to tell you about the kinds of situations that it can handle. And then if you say, ooh, this one's for me, I want to try it, there's an example in there that'll tell you how to go about doing it. It'll tell you kube control, the CLI, how to use that, so you can point that at a Kubernetes cluster, and then you can try it and see what happens. That might be a good way to get going, because it'll give you actual examples for the different types of things it knows how to describe and run.
Yeah, definitely check out and again, Kubernetes is hard. Like, all these concepts are quite difficult. For someone who's completely new to it, it's a lot to take in. But we're trying to improve the documentation to just make it more relevant. So things like the tutorial, which focus on just getting, like the example guestbook application up and running on Kubernetes. That's a great place to go and look at if it's your first time looking at Kubernetes.
Hey, is there any plan to get the application CRD really packet released with Kubernetes itself, or it will be always a side sub-project? What's the plan to raise the adoption of the application CRD? Because, yeah, that's the question.
Do you have an answer to this?
I have some thoughts on this. So right now, the application CRD is still in beta. I think the goal really is to get it to a stable API, and then ideally we just need to get more people using it. And then once we have more people using it, we can gauge whether it makes sense to contribute as a core API. I realize it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because it's harder to get people using it if it's an external API, but that, I think, is the way that I think we'll try to go.
I mean, this comes maybe more on the architecture, SIG architecture. I don't know, is there any plan to get still a CRD, but maybe ship by default or easily enabled with a release? I think it's fine to be like separate repo, etc. But like when I don't get the API, I want this included. No thanks.
So with Kubernetes, and Adnan, I think, let me see if I can find it. We talked about this process, right? This is one of the things that SIG architecture, one of the other special interest groups, work through that deals with this. And it used to be, the process was, right, you'd introduce something new to Kubernetes and then you'd iterate on it as part of Kubernetes. And they decided they didn't want to do that anymore. And so as part of the new process, in order for it to land inside of Kubernetes itself in a release, they want it to actually become popular, where a large group of people want to use it and have it included. Otherwise, it can just be installed as a separate third-party controller or as part of a distribution. And so we're kind of at the point right here where we're iterating on the CRDs and controllers, and we probably need some more people to drive it more to increase the popularity. The person who was originally driving it moved on to do something else, and it's probably languished a little bit since then. And I know you care about this because, heck, this came out of a lot of the work you did a year or two ago. And so it probably needs somebody to really start driving it, just because we've had a little bit of a void in leadership recently because of some stuff moving around. That's the honest answer. If you want to get involved or you know somebody, please send them our way and we will help them get ramped up to start driving this a little bit better. But in order for it to ship with Kubernetes itself, it's probably going to need to get a little bit of popularity out of it.
Okay, thanks.
And I'm happy to talk to you more about this afterwards, because I would love to see this happen. We had a question over here.
I have not contributed to Kubernetes not a committer, so just wanted to know, do you guys have any bootstrap program where people can, those who want to commit to it, they can get a head start on it? Or how do you go about becoming a commuter in one of these projects?
So are you specifically interested in SIG apps? Or?
Yes.
Okay. So there was a contributor summit yesterday, so I'm sure you can't go back in time. But there is a contributor summit at every KubeCon, so maybe you can attend one of those next time. But there's also the deep dive, which is a great place to go and just start learning about some of the controllers in SIG apps specifically. And then from there on, just try and get more involved in the meetings and, and find some issues to work on. I think we label starter issues in the Kubernetes KK repo, the core repo, so you can kind of filter by good starter issues and filter by SIG apps, so you can find things that are a good place to just get your feet wet and start contributing.
Is there something you personally like to do? We talked about a few things from documentation, coding, things like that. Is there an area in particular that interests you you'd want to go after?
Sorry.
Yeah. Love documentation, but maybe leave it aside for a minute. I would like to add to one of the controllers, like let's say you're writing new application controller, right? That CRD, that's still not out. If there are bugs on it, I'll start with those and start contributing with those.
Okay, some of the practical things might be, there is, I think it's in the community repo, there's a contributor's guide. Mm-hmm. And the contributor's guide walks you through, so Kubernetes, because it's a big complicated project with so many people who work on it, we have a lot of Kubernetes isms, things that you run into, like what are the different bots and what do they do? There's a contributor guide that will walk you through and kind of explain what all of these insider tribe things we have are when you want to go contribute for the first time. So I would suggest going and taking a look at that. It's a useful guide that explains a lot. The next thing is a little of this is going to depend on where you're going to go. If you want to go after something like the Application CRD, I would suggest going after the code and looking at KubeBuilder. KubeBuilder is one of the other sub-projects of Kubernetes that's under SIG API machinery that lets you build controllers. And that's actually used to build the Application CRD and controller. And so you can go look at that project. There's even a documentation. It is a doc book kind of thing where you can go read how to use it, and that'll help you get into the application controller, because then you'll understand how it works and if you want to go contribute. And there's opportunities to contribute to it. If you're talking about a core controller, those are a little bit different because they haven't been generated. They've been kind of hand curated. And for that, I would probably suggest going to the deep dive. That's tomorrow, because if I remember right, they're actually going to walk through that and help you get going with it. And so that may be a good place to see, here's how the core controllers work.
Okay.
Does that help?
I'm pretty familiar with the Kubernetes AMA. We run and deploy large-scale application, but I have not contributed anything to the project. So I was wondering if there is a good chance.
Oh, we'd love to have more contributors, and that's how you can hopefully get started.
So like the slide you just showed, like if we just want to kind of like use the application CRD and just kind of try it and use in our own application, how do we go about this? And like, is there like a Slack channel that we can kind of ask question about specific problem?
Do you want to take this or me too?
Yeah, sure. So the question was about getting involved in the application CRD and using it. Yeah. So the GitHub repo for application CRD is in Kubernetes SIG/application.
Something like I have to kind of use. So is this something I can just like do it on the namespace level, or I have to get cluster admin to do this stuff?
You need a cluster admin because it's a CRD that you have to install.
Oh, okay.
And then it's a controller that you have to install.
Okay.
But there are steps in this repository, in the README, to
how to do
show you
that
how to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, so you would follow the directions in here to install it and then try it out on your own stuff. The directions are all in the repository. And if they're not, please file an issue so we can add more to it. Yes, Slack channel.
Sorry, I forgot that.
SIG apps, all of the Kubernetes SIGs have a Slack channel. And so there's a SIG apps Slack channel, and you can go in there and ask a question. Sorry.
So besides packaging, such as Helm, et cetera, who do you see as other consumers of the application CRD primarily?
So the application CRD, consumers, if we can build it in popularity, there's a lot of opportunity here. For example, you could have something like, there's a bunch of dashboards. If you go down to the floor show, you'll see vendors with dashboards, things like Octant, which VMware has worked on, or Kubernetes dashboard. And you can now take this metadata that you have in a cluster and you can start to visualize it. And there's a lot of interesting things that you can do because you have that metadata together. In fact, if you know that maybe Helm and Helm 3 is working on something and you see something organized that way, you could start to orchestrate things like delete commands, things like that as well. There's a lot of opportunity just to have that metadata available and then start to act on it. So it's not just for those tools, it provides a cross-tool capability. Helm understands Helm stuff, right? Other tools understand their stuff. How do we make that work across tools? And that's where the application CRD provides an opportunity.
So is the primary purpose of the application CRD to present the pieces as a chunkier whole?
Yes, and so for example, I'm sorry, I'm jumping on this, but the controller itself provides a health check, and that health check can actually look at all of the things. So say WordPress, right? WordPress has maybe a deployment that's running WordPress and a StatefulSet that's running your database, like MariaDB, right? Do you want to check each of those for state? Or can you hit the application CRD and say, what's the status? Is it healthy? And it can check all of the things and see if they're healthy, right? And so there's some capabilities beyond just the metadata. Do we have any other questions?
There's one at the back.
Hey, Nick Mitchell from IBM. Thanks for all the great work on this. So I've been working with the SIG CLI over the past couple of months with some lightweight visual tooling for enhancing the CLI. Just curious whether you guys have established a desiderata of features that you might need from a visualization standpoint that would help with application development. Is there resources that I can sort of tap for that, or should I just join this discussion and work it out with discussion?
It's a good question, yeah. I don't know that we kind of, specifically around UI tooling, there's a few different things that we've discussed in SIG Apps before. So, more recently we had Octant demoed. In the past, we've obviously had things like the Kubernetes dashboard demoed and other tools. But yeah, I don't think that we've kind of had a working group that's like defining what a UI perspective of Kubernetes looks like, but that's definitely something that we'd be interested to discuss.
Or mainly, not so much UI necessarily, although that would be great, but just the CLI-driven enhancements. How can we enhance, from a CLI perspective, an application developer's experience? Do you have studies or any kind of?
I don't have anything offhand to share with you,
Oh, no,
but you've piqued my interest, so I'd love to talk with you more about it later.
Okay.
Yeah. And it sounds like that's an area that we can collaborate more with SIG CLI and other SIGs. There's also the new usability SIG.
Yeah, I was there too, yeah.
Yeah. So there's definitely, I think, some cross-collaboration efforts that we can
Sounds great,
do, yeah.
thanks.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions? Can we call it?
Yeah, I think we're just at time.
All right. Thank you all for coming. If you have any other questions, please feel free to come talk to us now, or come check out one of the SIG Apps meetings or mailing lists and reach out to us there. We're happy to help. Have a wonderful rest of your time here. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.